Welcome to Inside Media Relations, the podcast for PR people serious about getting their stories covered. We will examine why a story lands or disappears into thin air. I will speak with PR professionals and communications leaders who practice media relations every day to understand what actually works and why. In this episode, we will examine the story that lands. We will discover what really makes a story cut through. Is it the angle, the timing, or maybe the relationship with the journalist? Whether it's pitched, released, or strategically placed, why do some stories travel far and others die a death? We will look at real examples of stories that worked or stories that failed and look at what made the difference. To make this journey today, I'm joined by two very experienced and successful PR people. Fiona O'Malley is the CEO of the domestic violence charity Sonas, and Stephen Hopkins is the head of media at IBEC. Let's get inside media relations. Fiona, let's start with you. Tell me about a story that you may have worked on that you were surprised by the impact that it had. You shaped it up, you sent it out there. You didn't think it'd do as well as it did, and then it got really big.
Yeah, so I used to work for a PR agency when I lived in London, and we had a client that came to us called Contact a Family. It's a charity that supports families who have children with severe physical and mental disabilities, and they came to us with a blank slate and they said, we want increased brand awareness, we want media lands, and we would hopefully like that to translate to fundraising, to donations to our charity as well. But they didn't have any statistics. So I said, can I have access to the families that you work with and can I survey them? And the results of the survey were quite shocking. I suppose the questions that we asked them were asked in a way that I suppose no matter what the answers were, they would be relatively newsworthy. So the statistics that we came back was that the average cost of raising a child with severe physical and mental disabilities in London was more than 3 times the cost of children without these disabilities. And we also found that 1 in 3 families regularly went without heat and 1 in 4 families regularly went without meals. So when I saw these results, I knew they were very newsworthy and I was delighted sending it out, pitching it to the media, but I had no idea. It just spread like wildfire. It was Sky News, BBC News, BBC World News, all the tabloids, all the broadsheets, and a lot of regionals as well. And it was the media coverage was so busy. It was difficult finding enough spokespeople to go on and to take all the media interview requests.
And just tell me about I'm really interested in the kind of the tactic or the mechanic behind that. So you went to the membership base. You did a simple survey.
Yes.
How long did the survey take?
I think it was only 10 questions.
Okay.
So it didn't take them very long because we know they're busy. We didn't want anything too onerous.
And then you analysed the results, and the Newsline kind of came out of it. And did you just press release it then and send it out, or how did you do it?
Yes. So we drew up the press release, obviously sent it back to the client for approval for any tweaks, and then we sent it out to the media. So it was relatively smooth in terms of mechanics. And there's a real lesson there in the Newsline within your own membership base.
Stephen, you'd be used to that in IBEC, like surveys and that. What does that story look like for you that you worked on that was way bigger than you thought?
I'm probably going to deliberately not in this case pick an example of IBEC nor the American Chamber of Commerce, because for as long as I've been doing media, we have a public profile by the very nature of our organisation. Brexit, COVID, Trump twice. There's been big changes, politically that have impacted the companies that we represent. So not surprisingly, like Fiona, probably picking an example from my agency experience, because often the challenges are very different. And similar to that, I was working with a UK-based fintech company who had a growing Irish customer base, but had no footprint here. Had done a lot of marketing spend, but I suppose the natural progression for them was what can we do in the earned media space? And they had no plan. They had a budget, and that was kind of the height of it. And we were trying to figure out what can we do, I suppose, to position them. And similar, again to the example that Fiona gave, is there was kind of a couple of things. Ultimately we needed to do some form of research in order to kind of frame a story. But obviously they were in the foreign exchange space, so we were able to look a little bit at kind of personal habits around kind of financial health, etc. And the opportunity of what was kind of coming down the pipeline was that there was going to be an exit of 2 major financial institutions in the Irish market, KBC and Ulster Bank. So I suppose people probably had questions about the competitiveness of the banking landscape in Ireland, and maybe that would raise questions about offerings, etc. So I suppose that was the first point. And interesting enough, that landed really, really well wall-to-wall national coverage. We managed to get their UK spokesperson across a lot of broadcasts, which can be challenging when they don't necessarily have a footprint in Ireland. But the most rewarding part of that piece is that we were able to then kind of follow that up with a number of other pieces.
What was the main news line in that piece? What was
basically that Irish consumers were concerned about the lack of competition.
Okay.
So that was that piece. But we were able to follow that up. Say we did that in the summer. We were able to follow that up with a kind of a series of pieces of research. We did one around financial planning for Christmas, another one around holidays. So like the really interesting one about the holidays, we were able to break into maybe the I suppose the non-traditional main kind of broadsheet. We were able to go a lot more into kind of the consumer trade as well, tabloid trade as well.
Isn't that one of the amazing things with PR though? And the people that don't understand it, that notion that like when you look at it from the outside and you don't fully understand it, it's like magicking something up out of thin air. And like I always say to people, it's like that notion of like you're doing keepy uppies, and that, and especially when you're in an agency business, that you're keeping that link with the client and you're keeping it relevant and you're keeping it out there. But it is this thing of like that je ne sais quoi, like of finding what the newsline is that's going to resonate.
100%. And then, you know, if you find that sweet spot, there's an opportunity to build on that. So ultimately, when you do pieces of research like that, and I've worked with a HR company in a similar space, we did global media for them, where when you find that thought leadership position for them, you ultimately have trends. So that further positions their strength in that space as well, because you can say, well, this is what it was like last year versus this year. So the kind of opportunity even for growth for those clients is huge.
And I suppose there's a piece too around both of those examples that when you back it up with a good spokesperson's performance, then you build that credibility, and then the relationship comes from that. And the person goes, oh, these people are good at sourcing stories. Like the next day I have dead air or I'm really stuck. And like the call we all love to get as PR people is, look, program's a bit bare tomorrow. Is there anything on your desk that would help me? And then you know that you're in the driving seat. So Stephen, if you could give me one, and this is a hard question, but if you could give me one sentence, what makes a story land for you as a PR person? So what, in one sentence, what's the answer? What's the answer to that?
Like, it's very simple. I'm going to try and do this in one, but it's ultimately it's finding your moment in the news cycle to insert your narrative.
Okay. Fiona?
Well, I can do it in one word, a good hook. I remember years ago I used to work for this, I won't actually name the charity, but I used to work for a charity, and the lady who I reported to didn't have a background in marketing or PR and wanted something sent out to the media. And I think what she thought the headline of the press release, it was nearly a paragraph long and it was so heavily branded. And I was like, this isn't going to go anywhere. And I was trying to explain the concept of a hook, and I was saying it's kind of like a crude example, but it's nearly like gossip. Like if you can summarize something that's interesting in one sentence, that's your hook. And if that's what something newsworthy is. And if I think sometimes journalists are so up to their eyes and they're expected to produce so much. So if you write articles or write press releases nearly in the style of an article where the hook is in the first line of the press release, like the headline of the press release, you're more likely to get good lands.
I used to do a press release writing course, and I had an equation in it that said good idea plus hook equals story. And sometimes people will come to you and they'll say, I have an idea. And that's all it is. It's like a raw idea that's kind of floating in midair that isn't anchored anywhere. And it's only when you explain to them, and it's one of those funny ones. I was joking with a friend of mine who's a musician last week, and Leo Moran from the Saw Doctors, I was listening to him on a podcast, and they were talking about songwriting, and he said, oh sure, if I knew how to write a song, I'd tell you, he said. He said, they all just come to me. But there's a bit here where like you do have to anchor it in the context. That's what's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting what you're saying about the Saw Doctors, because I remember Billy Connolly, one person asked him how jokes work, and he said, I don't know, I'm just glad I'm here when it arrives. But yeah, I think just having something new or interesting or a different angle on something is so important, because as you say, if it's just an idea, it's not really anything. And once it grabs you, and I suppose a good kind of measure of if something will land, like I would always say to clients, I'm someone of average intelligence and average abilities, and if I understand and if I am interested, then a journalist will probably understand, be interested, and therefore the public will probably understand, be interested. And I think oftentimes people, particularly when they're passionate about a subject, or even if it's very complex, like if it's medical or legal, they can really struggle with simplifying it. But actually the best medical lectures and legal lectures are the ones that can simplify complex issues.
And that's a skill. Like I've done a lot
yeah.
of media training with scientists, and you always meet the scientist who comes kind of really pent up and like not giving an inch, and like they'll have a go at you then, and they'll say, "You're trying to dumb me down," and you'll say, like I used to have a line when I'd get there, "You're trying to dumb me down," I'd always say, "No, I'm trying to open you up.
Yeah.
I'm trying to explain it." And like my mother is a huge touchstone for anything that I do, and that like if I'm ever in a media setting and I'd ring my mum afterwards, and if she said to me, "Geez, that went right over my head," I think, "Okay, we failed there today."
Yeah.
Whereas if she could explain, if she could understand it, it would really work. Stephen, tell me your view on this. Like, what's more important, the quality of the story or the relationship with the journalist? So what's going to be more of a factor on if something lands or if it doesn't?
You're not going to be surprised by this answer. The answer is both, really, right? Like, of course, and actually kind of linked to what we're talking about there. We can all think of those examples in our career where we managed to find the story when it maybe didn't exist. But also part of this, we've also been with clients or been working for organizations where we have something brilliant, and actually the skill is making sure we maximize it as much as possible, right? So, of course, if you have a good story and you understand the fundamentals of landing a story, it should have a good impact. But I'm more interested is in those moments where you can really maximize and ultimately rinse the cut through. Because particularly in nowadays where like how people receive their news is so fragmented that often when you have a big story, you need to be cutting through multiple platforms. You need to be cutting through multiple newspapers as part of that. So going back to your question then about the relationship with the journalist, I think again, if you understand the journalist well, you understand what interests them. You understand how they will receive the story. You'll ultimately understand who you should target and have that conversation with. So the answer is kind of both. But I think particularly on those moments where you have a good story and you need to maximize it, that relationship with the journalist is really important.
Okay, what do you think about that, Fiona?
Yeah, I agree. And actually talking about cutting through, before I came into PR, I worked as a journalist myself, and I was very junior, but I did a couple of internships. I did one for Vogue magazine, for the Sunday Times, and then I wrote a few pieces for the Irish Times and the Observer. But when I was on the news desk in the Sunday Times, we would easily get like 100 press releases an hour, and one of the editors said, if I'm not captured within the first 5 words, I probably won't read on. And she said one time when she was reading a book, even though it was recommended to her, she didn't read more than 2 words because she just kind of recoiled. And I said, God, what were the first 2 words? And she said, Malcolm awoke. And she said, I didn't like the name Malcolm and I thought awoke was pretentious. So you have to consider that the person on the other side probably is inundated and by default will have a low attention span. The
two examples of in my career of things that I didn't realise would end up where they did happened within about 3 weeks of each other 24 years ago. And I was working for the Progressive Democrats, and Michael McDowell, he's still a senator, had an unbelievable sense of the context of news and his ability to insert himself in. So around then, Bertie Ahern was planning a national stadium which became called the Bertie Bowl. And I got a call one day, it was a week before the election campaign, and he used to do these kind of his office was at the Triangle in Ranelagh, and he used to do this like a speech from the Triangle in Ranelagh. And as one of the lads used to say, you'd imagine him going out to the traffic lights like and delivering the speech. But it was his views on the on this new stadium, and he just rang me and he said, can you issue this? And in those days you would fax it to people and then you would print it off and walk across the road to Leinster House and hand it out to the journalists. And to my great eternal shame, I didn't even read the thing, right? I was doing what I was told, walked across, handed it out, and I walked from South Redrick Street to Leinster House, and the podcast room was on the 2nd floor. And when I came back, my mobile rang, and it was Mark Brannock, who was with the Irish Times at the time, and he said, this is good stuff, a lot of really strong stuff here. I like the stuff, I like the Ceausescu stuff. And I said, oh yeah, the Ceausescu stuff. I hadn't read it. And in it, he described it as akin to a vanity project, the former Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. He said it was a Ceausescu era project that had no place in modern politics, and the whole story blew up. And Mary Harney even rang me and said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "I was only doing what I was told." Fast forward then to the middle of the election campaign, and it looked like Fianna Fáil were going to get an overall majority. Everybody was wrecked. It was a Saturday, and he rang me and he said, "Can you come out?" He said, "and can you get the media to come with you? I'm putting up a poster just off the Triangle in Ranelagh, and I just want to get some media coverage." And the poster said, "Single party government, no thanks." It's on Reeling in the Years. So if you go to Reeling in the Years from 2002, you see me with a very bad denim jacket, picking this lamppost outside Ken Doherty's mother's house, and it became the moment of the campaign. And the whole of the countries thought that Fianna Fáil can't get an overall majority. They need someone in there as a check and balance. And that was his unbelievable instinct on the context of news. Talk to me about that then, about the context of news, and Stephen, you'd be used to this because people come to the organisations that you've worked at. I'm thinking of IBEC now. People would come for a spokesperson, someone to say something. You can say the safe thing.
Yeah.
You can drive it over the edge. You can, you a lot of your day job would be working on, someone's on a beat and there's a story on the latest development and they need a comment from you guys. But you can manage that opportunity in different ways.
Yeah. It's really interesting, the Michael McDowell story. That intuition for a media story is incredible, and part of that, as you said, is understanding the context. I think working with IBEC, I think we understand that we have like a level of analysis and expertise. And I've been honest with you, we don't play it safe when we see the value for our members. If ultimately we have to say something or take a particular position, we are comfortable doing that when that's kind of the right thing for the organization. So I suppose from that context is like, our kind of, if the right thing to do is to engage with the media as part of that, of course, we do that and kind of consider it within that context. But I think kind of even more fundamentally to that is that often when kind of things are developing, particularly in the regulatory and the policy landscape, often it takes a couple of weeks before we kind of get to that point. So I often find kind of the really effective ways to kind of insert yourself into that context is in the early beginnings of that conversation when journalists are starting to become interested and engaging with journalists so that you become ultimately the kind of the point for that particular issue or that sector and then how it relates to them,
What do you think about that, Fiona? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's kind of building trust over years with journalists and pitching good quality stories to them. And that's why sometimes if you ask, or if someone that you report to asks you to send out something and it's not going to land, you kind of you're kind of frustrated and try to push back and say, I don't think it's going to land for X, Y, Z reasons. But also the odd time that they might be quite forceful and insistent, then you're also at the back of your mind conscious that, well, this will reduce my, how I am perceived in terms of, they're a good spokesperson on these issues, or they're a good person to go to if, we need an op-ed, or, we need an exclusive, or we need a case study. So I think it's about building trust and being consistent, because, if you don't pitch good quality content and newsworthy stories, not only are you eroding that trust, but you get people unsubscribing.
And what works really well with journalists that PR people don't underestimate? What cuts through with journalists that you do in your daily work that that doesn't have probably as much of value on it as it should?
I was going to say, kind of linked to that, like the cardinal sin, I think, in our world is not getting back to a journalist. I think that going back to Fiona's point about the relationships, I think what certainly is very important for us as an organisation is that if there are particular moments in time where we're not in a position to comment, is to have that conversation with the journalists, provide a context of why we're not been able to gauge at this particular point. And I think, in a world where journalists are moving from story to story very quickly, that kind of honest kind of conversations that you have with them, I think does build up an enormous amount of trust. So when there is that opportunity to kind of engage on a particular topic, there is a really, really strong mutual trust between yourself and that particular journalist.
One thing that really frustrates me, and like I spend my life building tools to try and make the interaction easier and trying to make the cut through easier, is that people will slavishly spray and pray something where they don't think for 5 minutes, oh, well, the radio journalist has different needs, the Sunday journalist has different needs. There's no point in sending that to a local journalist. And that just a little bit of management around how you're sending it out. And like we talk about the story circle, you build your audience, you craft your story. There's craft in sending. And I'd like to hear your views on this about what makes the news. Like if I'm working on a daily radio program, getting a heads up today that, look, this is going out tomorrow. We will have a spokesperson tomorrow for this. Can you keep this to yourself? But like, I'm just giving you a heads up here now because, I'll be issuing this tomorrow and then you'll be scraping around looking for someone. But I'm saying I'm available here today. What's your view on that, Fiona?
Yeah, absolutely. Forward planning is really important. And I think particularly if you have something that you think will land really well, it's important to have actually a few spokespeople prepped and ready and on script, because oftentimes when you're booking in, as you know, lots of radio interviews, sometimes schedules clash and you need at least 2, if not 3 spokespeople to be familiar with
that can be and like, we're not talking about your current jobs now, but like poor execution by spokespeople is very frustrating for PR people because it's that thing I used to say to people, like, I land the ball on your forehead 6 yards out from the goal. I just need you to score it. And like I've been involved in jobs with people where, and the thing that is just the greatest crime for me is that you have an opportunity that you can't avail of.
I've heard that I wasn't involved in this, but I had heard.
He said, yeah.
It genuinely wasn't. I'd heard someone, a PR person, that told me before that they'd managed to get their client onto the diary of a CEO, and the execution was that poor they never published it. Imagine landing a top tier podcast like that. And the result is they don't publish it, that's just sounds heartbreaking, actually.
I had a client once who I got on a really kind of prominent show, and they rang me back, and the reason they didn't want to do it was that they were scared and they weren't up to it. And they said, I don't like that journalist. And I said, what's that got to do with anything? I said, I don't like them. I don't like half the journalists. I said, but like, that's nothing to do with anything. I said, like, if not liking people stopped you from doing things, you wouldn't do half the things that you were supposed to do. And the reason was that they were just petrified about the opportunity,
Execution is so important. And to Fiona's point, allowing that time. And we've all been there with clients where we have pushed back on the timing of when they wanted something to drop because they haven't enabled or allowed you enough time to have those conversations with journalists. And go back to your point about, I suppose, figuring out what interests journalists. Again, another cardinal sin I'm going to say is, particularly in an Irish context. I've worked in media landscapes in the UK and the US. Relationships are tough. It's a much broader landscape. In Ireland, you should really know your media intimately, and you should understand kind of what makes them tick and what's their interest, because we are dealing ultimately with a smaller pool of journalists than you would be in other countries.
And like I suppose the other thing too that like it's let's shine a light on this for a minute or two, that you craft a good story, you have a really good hook, you have a really good angle, but then the kind of strategy piece comes about, well, what are we going to do with this, and how are we going to get this out there? And sometimes people say to me, well, how do you do that? And I often say to them, have you ever seen, what I always say to people, someone who isn't a PR person, have you ever seen Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And they'll say, yeah. Well, I said, it's like a series of lifelines. And I said, like, if you're going to be happy with it, if the lifeline that you choose is going to get you to where you need to get to it, then you'll use it. So you're not going to use phone a friend if you just waste it, or you're not going to do 50-50 if you're going to waste it. So I said, whatever lifeline you pick, and whether it's send a press release, pitch it, have an exclusive, like there's a whole host of ways of doing it, but you have to be happy with the outcome. Fiona, do you use any particular decision process when you get something? Is it purely on gut? Is it like, okay, I need to send this far and wide, or this is really tailor-made for this kind of context, or how do you approach it?
Yeah, I probably would use my gut, but then obviously, for example, the Sundays, you have to send that out way in advance because they probably will be planning the week ahead. And I've been in a situation before where person you report to is like, no, we need to send it out. We definitely need to get in the Sundays. And you're like, it's 4 o'clock on a Friday. Like, you're wasting your time.
Yeah.
And similarly, when people sometimes plan, they can assume, in my experience, people who probably don't understand the media landscape as much, they can assume that everyone will want an exclusive. So, for example, I used to work for CMRF Cumlin, the charity for Cumlin Children's Hospital, and someone that I was working with was very knowledgeable in marketing and fundraising, but didn't fully understand PR, and they were lining up case studies, and we did have a good bank of case studies, but she's nearly tearing her hair out, and she was like, oh, well, if we send this to the Irish Times and we can't use it in the Indo, and then this will have to, this case study can go to the Sunday Times. And I was like, we're not giving exclusives unless they ask for them. And oftentimes in my experience, when you send something out, then they might cover it, which would be great. But oftentimes people come back and say, we'd like to do something similar, but can we have a different case study and can we have an exclusive? And I'm always happy to agree to those kind of things. But I think sometimes people overestimate how much the media want exclusive on things.
Yeah, and then it's funny, like you see stuff where you find that RT are sometimes more obsessed about another RT program. They don't listen to news talk at all. Like, so you'd be thinking they'd be worried about it being on a competitor station, and they're only worried about it that nobody else appears anywhere else on their schedule, which can be very challenging on a rolling news story. What's your view on that, Stephen?
Yeah, like I think like ultimately you should assign the tactics based on ultimately the story you had, and I said it kind of at the start that if you have a big enough piece, well then you should be looking for that blanket coverage. You should be, but also part of that process is also to think about the alternatives. Like we're sitting here on a podcast as well, there's been a huge kind of revolution that's happened in our media space, particularly in our traditional media space as well. We spoke before we came on around particular news outlets that have done well in the podcast space. It's really, really important that you explore every kind of opportunity that exists in terms of your kind of tools when you're going to strategy. And of course, there will be, we've examples where we decide we do want to go an exclusive route because it's going to be a longer sit-down piece with one of the Sundays. I think you've got to be really clear what's the outcome of what you're trying to achieve here. I'll give you a very simple example. In some cases, if I'll work with maybe an organisation within our umbrella, within IBEC. And part of it is just that they want an opportunity to be able to find an op-ed that they can set out their priorities. And actually, it doesn't need to be necessarily a top tier. They just want a kind of a digital footprint of ultimately that's a third party rather than putting it on their own blogs as well. So it's also important when you're working with a client or an organisation, what's the outcome we're ultimately trying to achieve here,
Cheers. So let's do the rapid fire round. A series of 5 questions. I gave you these questions in advance. If you can be brief with your answers, and I'll do each of you separately, and I'll go through the 5 questions. So I'll start with you, Fiona. What is one media moment that has changed how you work?
I suppose when I came back from London, I took a comms role with the Uni Students in Ireland, and I remember I had this kind of mentor when I was in London, and she said, obviously it's important to be proactive when it comes to the media, but it's equally as important to be reactive. And at the time, Brexit was everywhere in the news. No one wanted to talk about anything apart from Brexit. So I went to the president of USI at the time and I said, we need to talk about Brexit and how it affects us. And he said, but for the Uni Students in Ireland, it won't affect us at all. So I was kind of, baffled, but also kind of saying, well, A, we need to find a way that it's going to affect us, but B, it affects the Erasmus programs. It affects our students going over to the UK and vice versa. So I suppose really considering and appreciating the importance of reactive, looking at what's in the media cycle and trying to shoehorn your own angle and your own client into the story is important.
And you're very good at that. Give me one example of something that failed that you learned from.
Again, when I was working in London at a PR agency, there was one of our clients was Wagamama, and they came to us and they had their first draft of what they said was going to go out in the press release, and the press release just read like an advert. It was Wagamama was every second or third word, and I said it's way too heavily branded, it's not going to get any coverage whatsoever, even in really small regionals, but they were insistent. We sent it out, it got no media as we predicted, and anyways we had quite a disagreement with the client because they were very disappointed. We were like, we told you ad nauseum, this is way too heavily branded. We sent it out again, and it was like, I think there was Wagamama was mentioned 3 times throughout the press release, and it got really good coverage then. But again, kind of not only just trusting your gut, but trusting your experience, and not being led down the path of insistence, because as we discussed earlier, not only it's not going to land, but it will erode that relationship of trust that you've built up with the media.
What's one universal belief about public relations that you think is wrong or overstated?
I think it's overstated that everyone will want an exclusive. I don't think that's true, and I think people are happy to cover the bulk of the press release, and if they want an exclusive, they might come back and ask for it or ask for a variation of the press release or the case study you've pitched to them.
Yeah, and sometimes a story has an energy, and it benefits from the fact that more than one person is talking about it, and that it's out there. What is one piece of advice that you wish you'd heard earlier in your career?
One piece of advice that I wish I heard earlier was not to sweat the small stuff. And what I mean by that is sometimes you can obsess over every single detail that's going out and try to plan a campaign down to the minute. But things don't work that way, particularly when you're working nearly against or alongside an active news cycle. So, sometimes things, if you think in your mind they're really newsworthy, they're going to land really well. And if they don't, there's always the next campaign.
And finally, what book do you think everyone in your job should read?
So I actually took a screenshot because I can never remember the author's name. It's Donald Miller, and it's Building a Story Brand, Clarify Your Message so Customers Will Listen. It's #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, and it's pretty good. It kind of gives a good overview of the life cycle of a brand and how to align a brand with the correct customers. But you can take those learnings and align the brand to the correct journalists that will be interested in your messaging and your story.
Okay, Stephen, I'll start with you and your 5 questions. What's one media moment that has changed how you work?
Yeah, and it came a little bit actually later in my career, because I think and this is probably the difference for when you've worked in-house and agency, when you're working in-house, you're ultimately, you're the chief spokesperson in lots of ways, and you can probably take things quite personally when journalists are a certain way. And then I went over to agency, and there was a particular journalist, very prominent journalist, and there was a particular issue with a certain client, and this had been ongoing for months. And then another opportunity came, where a really good opportunity came with another client, and you're having that thought, it's like, are you going to give it to that? But would it make sense to give it to that journalist? They're a prominent journalist in their field, and I did give it to them, and because it was the right thing to do for the client, and it was the right thing for them to cover the story, and it ultimately changed the dynamic of the relationship. And what I realized there and then is, and it's to change my framing, journalists have a job to do, and you have a job to do, and just to remember that, in terms of, not to take it personally, probably as much at times,
and the work, and I suppose for good and for bad, the work can improve or disimprove the relationship. So, like how the flow of the work
100%.
is going. Give me one example of something that failed that you learned from.
Yeah, a big one for me. I had a very big project early on in my career. Very proud of this project. It looked at kind of the corporate social responsibility of impact of a group of companies. Massive project, big investment. Was really excited by the stories that the companies were doing. It was a wide strategic communications project, and it was my early days, and I didn't realize that media was a different beast. And often what's a really compelling story with the organizations you're working with isn't necessarily a media story. So it comes back to the news hook ultimately. So, a project of that scale should have got a media return. It ultimately different and isn't. And what I learned then was that ultimately media, within the grand scheme of strategic communications and corporate affairs, media is a different beast, because ultimately we're talking about the news. And if you're not delivering a news story, why would they cover it,
Yeah, and you have to be ruthless about the hook. You have to be ruthless about, and you have to say, look, nobody cares. That's a phrase I use all the time. And someone will say, oh, what, we're rebranding, or we've a new website, but nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. What is one universal belief about public relations you think is wrong or overstated?
Yeah, it probably won't surprise some people, is that kind of that PR is all spin. It's not about that. It's about refining the message for your organization. It's about helping your organization hit their key audiences. Ultimately, it's about trying to present the best case forward, ultimately, for your client or for your organization, and kind of build a compelling narrative to hit your audiences.
What's one bit of advice you'd wished you'd heard earlier in your career?
Yeah, a big one for me was, I used to think that, particularly when you work in the regulatory and the policy landscape, which I spent most of my career in doing, you think you need to be the expert on the policy, right? And actually, what you're bringing to your organization is that you understand the macro environment. So spend more time learning the skill sets of how journalists work, what the context is, and feed that back into the business. Because when something serious does happen to your organization, you're not going to be the expert on X policy. What you will be the expert on is how you navigate the media landscape or the communication strategy for that organization. So, I often say to younger people starting off in their career, develop the skill set about the macro environment and figure out how you feed that back into the business. And again, I think when you've worked in agency, you figure that out a little bit more because you're always looking kind of out. When you're in-house, you can be a little bit insular at times and a little bit too much focused on what's happening in your organization.
Yeah, and it's funny, agency be very like working in a political party as well, in that, you know, I describe my time working in politics like an industrial level media relations, in that like some days we were sending out 10 press releases before lunchtime, and that was just a muscle that we kept rinse and repeat. And the funny thing is that like you'd have a big policy that you'd hope you'd get a whole lot of coverage on, and then you'd go and the journalists would be just obsessed about something else, and then another day you'd have a crack off someone on some policy and you'd be on the top 3 stories on 6 o'clock news, and you'd have to put zero effort into it, which is kind of funny. What book do you think everyone in your job should read?
It was really funny. I was telling a former colleague of yours the book I was going to mention, and they said that you suggested this book, which is about how to win influence. Or How to Win Friends and Influence by Dale
Carnegie.
Carnegie, that's the author. And I read the book years ago, and I've recommended it over the years as well to people, because ultimately, and I think anyone starting off in their career, even if they're not in the communication space, like you need to understand ultimately how you build relationships and influence others. And regardless of what you do in an organization, that's such an important skill set.
It really is. And like I used to say to people, like when you go on, like when I would arrange gigs when I was in the coalface of PR, and I'd always seek out the person I didn't know, and I'd sit on the bus beside them, or make sure my flight, if I was booking the trip, that my seat on the plane was beside them, and I'd figure out did they like Chapel Roan or Man United, or were they from Leitrim or Tipperary? And I would just try and understand what made them tick and what way they were, and dealing with them was far easier then.
I'm going to slightly cheat and mention a podcast as well. It's another one I recommend all the time. When It Hits the Fan, the BBC4 podcast. Brilliant PR gurus. They've worked for Director of Comms for Manchester United. They works in Windsor. Built up PR agencies, former journalists, and the thing that they do, which is really, really useful, they take what's happening in the world and put it through a communications and PR lens. So it's really valuable kind of learning if you're kind of working in the world of PR and comms and seeing current events through that lens.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Fiona. That was Inside Media Relations. Thanks for joining us today. Come back next time when we will be looking at some more tactics, some more tips, some more strategy to help you get your story further, faster, to more people. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.